Hey guys, tonight we're going to slip quietly into a world that most history books prefer to keep in the margins. It isn't the story of emperors standing on marble steps, nor of generals marching legions across the frontiers. Instead, it is about something smaller, humbler, and believe it or not, strangely revealing. We're going to explore the toilets of ancient Rome, and in doing so, we'll uncover not just how Romans relieved themselves, but how they understood community, order, health, and even the divine. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to dim the lights, settle into your pillow, and let the sounds around you soften into a background hum. Think of this as not just another history lesson, but as a quiet journey, a slow walk through a city that lived and breathed 2,000 years ago. And as always, if you enjoy this kind of story, feel free to subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. It's always fascinating to see the little map of voices that joins us from around the world. Now close your eyes and imagine the stones of Rome beneath your sandals, the air cool before the day's heat rises, and the distant rumble of water flowing unseen under the streets. Tonight, we begin with the most ordinary of acts, and in it, discover the extraordinary soul of an empire. Vibes. The streets of Rome stir with early life. The sun is still low, painting the rooftops with a pale glow, while vendors begin to unpack their goods. A woman sweeps her doorstep. A baker opens his oven, the scent of warm bread curling into the air. Amid this familiar bustle lies a doorway that might be overlooked by most. Time. 9/5. It is plain, unadorned, tucked between shops or near a bathhouse. Yet to step inside is to enter one of Rome's most curious and essential inventions, the public toilet, or forica. You pass through the doorway, and the noise of the street dulls. The air inside is cool, heavy with the faint dampness of stone. Time. 0.95. Benches line the walls, long slabs carved with evenly spaced openings. Beneath them, water trickles steadily in narrow channels, carrying away whatever is left behind. The sound is constant, reassuring, a reminder that here, in this hidden chamber, the city's great system of aqueducts and sewers is at work. Privacy, however, is nowhere to be found. Men sit side by side, their robes gathered, speaking as though they were in a marketplace. Strangers exchange news of the forum. Friends share gossip. Rivals argue about grain prices or the outcome of gladiatorial games. The room is alive with voices, and for a moment you almost forget where you are. For Romans, relieving oneself was not a solitary act, but a social one. Another opportunity to weave the threads of community. On a low shelf nearby, rest bundles of sponge-tipped sticks, called tersoria. They soak in basins of vinegar or salt water, ready to be used and then replaced for the next person. To us, this may seem unthinkable, but to Romans, it was ordinary. A habit woven into their understanding of hygiene and efficiency. The notion of mine and yours blurred in places like this, just as food was shared at banquets and water was shared in the baths. The engineering is what makes it all possible. Rome's aqueducts, arching across hills and valleys, brought fresh water into the city. From there, it was channeled not only to fountains and baths, but also to these latrines. Waste passed into the sewers, some small, some vast like the Cloaca Maxima, and eventually emptied into the Tiber River. To sit here was to take part in a system as grand, time 0.6, in its own way, as any temple or theatre. The flow beneath your feet was part of the same network that fed fountains, gardens, and palaces. Still, the atmosphere carried a strange mix of order and unease. The cool stone pressed against your skin, the echo of voices surrounded you, and always, beneath it all, the trickle of water. The smell was present but less overwhelming than you might expect. The constant flow kept corruption at bay. Yet unease lingered. Romans spoke of vapors rising from the sewers, of foul air that could sicken the unwary. Fires sometimes broke out when torches met pockets of gas. Creatures, rats, insects, even snakes were said to appear from the channels below. To sit here was to trust the system, but also to live with its risks. And yet, people came every day. They had to. The poor who lived in crowded apartments depended on these halls because their homes had no private facilities. The wealthy, though they might have latrines in their villas, also used public ones when in the city. Senators, merchants, soldiers, slaves, all found themselves side by side on the same benches, stripped of rank by the simple fact of nature. For a brief moment, hierarchy dissolved, and necessity made equals of them all. It is strange to think that in this humble chamber you see Rome most clearly. Here is the communal spirit of the empire. People together, unashamed, practical. Here is the engineering genius, water tamed and put to constant work. Here is the resilience, accepting risks, laughing at inconvenience, carrying on as if nothing could disturb the order. And here is the humanity, voices rising in gossip, in satire, in laughter, even as water carries waste away into the unseen depths. You leave the hall and step back into the sunlit street. Behind you, the toilet continues its quiet labor, benches polished by centuries of use, water running endlessly beneath. Ahead of you, the city hums, unaware that its strength rests not only on arches and armies, but also on what lies hidden in the stone chambers of its latrines. You rise from the shadows of memory, stepping deeper into a world where the familiar rhythms of Roman life pulse beneath the stonework of the city. The streets are alive with merchants calling their prices, sandals scraping across marble steps, and the faint tang of olive oil drifting from nearby kitchens. But beneath this thriving empire, hidden in plain sight, lay one of the most curious inventions of the ancient world: public toilets. Not the discreet, private rooms that later centuries would imagine, but communal halls of stone and swoon, time 0.65s, where Romans gathered as much for necessity as for conversation. Imagine walking down a crowded street in the Subura, the bustling neighborhood where taverns, workshops, and tenements crowded each other in narrow lanes. You hear the splash of water running beneath the paving stones, part of the city's vast aqueduct system. And then you come upon a modest entrance that leads into a chamber lined with smooth benches, each carved with evenly spaced holes. Beneath them flows a channel of water, carrying waste away with quiet efficiency. The Romans called it a phorica, and to step inside was to join a ritual as public as a forum speech. Privacy was not the point here. In fact, privacy hardly existed. Men and women often entered separate facilities, but within those walls, every sound, smell, and expression was shared. Friends might talk politics while seated side by side. Rivals might debate over law or gladiator games, and strangers might exchange gossip as easily as they shared the same air. To the Roman mind, this was not crude, it was civilization. Cleanliness and order mattered more than modesty, and the hum of voices in such a place was no different than the chatter of a marketplace. Yet, beneath the chatter lingered ritual. Near the entrance, you might notice a row of sponge-tipped stick time 12.65s, resting in basins of salt water or vinegar. These tessoria served as communal cleaning tools, passed from one person to the next. To us, this may spark unease, but to Romans it was simply habit, one woven into the fabric of shared existence. The notion of mine and yours blurred in ways that spoke to a culture rooted less in personal boundaries and more in collective order. Still, the engineering behind these toilets was nothing short of astonishing. Fresh water poured in through lead or clay pipes, keeping the channels beneath the seats flowing. The waste joined the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer, and from there was swept into the Tiber. Even in its murkiness, this system represented something profound, the empire's ability to tame nature, to impose order where chaos might otherwise reign. To sit upon a stone bench and relieve oneself was, oddly enough, to participate in the same marvel of engineering that kept fountains splashing and baths steaming. But imagine, too, the atmosphere. Stone floors cool beneath sandaled feet, echoes rising as if from a cavern, and the steady trickle of water masking what might otherwise be an uncomfortable chorus. The air was heavy, tinged with dampness and humanity, but not stagnant, for constant flow kept corruption at bay. A Roman stepping into such a hall may not have thought about its ingenuity, but they would have felt its order. This was no accident. It was culture, carved in stone and sustained by water. For the poor who lived in cramped apartments without private facilities, these places were lifelines. For the wealthy, they were reminders that even status bowed before nature. Senators, soldiers, merchants, and laborers, each found themselves seated in the same row, stripped of hierarchy by the simplest human act. And in this leveling lay an odd truth about Roman society. Even in its most hierarchical age, necessity had the power to flatten distinctions, at least for a moment. Perhaps the most curious detail was how conversation thrived here. Archaeologists and historians suggest that for many Romans, toilets doubled as informal gathering places. Deals were struck, plans whispered, and laughter shared amid the marble and the water. To modern ears, this might sound absurd, but for Rome, it was continuity, business and bodily needs conducted together, unembarrassed, unashamed. And as you imagine this scene, the sound of sandals shifting, the drip of water echoing, voices murmuring like a low tide, you realize that Roman toilets were more than function. They were mirrors of the empire itself, communal, pragmatic, efficient, and oddly theatrical. To sit there was to take part in a daily performance, one where every citizen, from baker to senator, shared the same stage. You step further into this world, where Rome's toilets are no longer just curiosities of design, but reflections of deeper truths about the empire itself. To understand them is to understand how Romans thought about purity, health, and even the divine. These spaces weren't merely carved benches and trickling water. They were woven into a broader system of belief and order. Cleanliness, to the Roman mind, was not just practical, but sacred. The goddess Cloacina, a deity whose name still echoes in the word cloaca, sewer, was honored with shrines near the great drains of the city. Imagine it, a goddess who ruled over filth, yet whose worship underscored the Romans' respect for the unseen networks that sustained life. To step into a forica was, in some sense, to move under her gaze. It reminded the citizen that even the humblest flows of water and waste belonged to a cosmic balance. And so, toilets became part of civic pride. Cities that lacked them were marked as backward, crude, or unworthy of Roman standards. When Roman engineers brought their aqueducts and latrines to conquered lands, they weren't simply installing infrastructure. They were exporting civilization. To wash, to bathe, to sit together on marble benches, these were signs of being Roman. Imagine a villager from Gaul stepping into a newly built public latrine, marveling at the polished stone and running water. It was a quiet lesson. Rome had arrived, and with it, order. Yet, for all their sophistication, the system had shadows. Flowing water carried away waste. Yes, but it also carried unseen dangers. Parasites, bacteria, and foul gases still lingered. Archaeologists studying ancient latrines have found eggs of whipworm, roundworm, and other parasites clinging to layers of hardened deposits. So while Romans believed themselves pioneers of hygiene, they lived with hidden threats. In fact, their communal habits, sharing sponges, breathing the same damp air, probably spread disease as much as their aqueducts spread water. Still, in their eyes, these places were triumphs. Picture the moment at dawn when the doors creaked open. Time ton and fives. Light spilled across rows of benches polished by countless bodies. A stream gurgled faintly below. The first citizens stepped in, merchants beginning their day, laborers pausing before work, children darting in to fetch water or gossip. These halls belonged to the city as much as markets or temples. They were gathering points, woven into the rhythm of life. And in those rhythms, conversation bloomed. Politics, wagers on gladiatorial games, mutterings about grain prices, all found their way into the air between stone walls. In a society where men spent hours in public baths, forums, and theatres, the toilet was simply another place to socialize. Archaeologists even suspect that graffiti once decorated the walls, snatches of verse, crude jokes, or reminders of debts. In those marks, laughter lived beside necessity. But beyond the chatter, there was symbolism. The very act of sitting shoulder to shoulder, facing the same necessity, time 0.65, broke down barriers. A senator and a slave might not share the same home, but in the Foraker, they shared space. This was Rome in miniature, hierarchy preserved in law and custom, yet momentarily blurred by the demands of the body. Yet, for all its normalcy, there was unease. To both time 0.95s. Writers of the time occasionally mentioned the dangers of foul vapors rising from below. These miasmas, as they believed, could poison the air and bring sickness. Some Foraker had ventilation shafts to release the gases. Others placed braziers to keep the air moving. Even so, stepping inside carried a hint of risk. You relieved yourself not just of waste, but of the fear that something unseen might follow you home. And so the Roman toilet becomes more than stone and water. It becomes a metaphor. For all their brilliance, Romans built systems both powerful and fragile. Their drains carried away filth, but they could never fully cleanse the unseen. Their communal habits fostered unity, yet also carried hidden costs. Still, they embraced these places without shame, because to them, the balance between necessity and civilization was clear. Better to gather in stone halls than to scatter filth across the streets. As you imagine yourself seated there, the hum of voices all around, the trickle of water echoing in the stone, and the faint light slipping through an open doorway, you realize how close you are to the heartbeat of Rome. Here, in these most human of places, the empire revealed itself, practical, communal, ordered, yet never entirely free of the shadows that lurked beneath the surface. The hum of voices fades as you lean closer to the stone walls, tracing their rough texture with your gaze. For these public toilets were not only vessels of utility, they were also mirrors of the Roman obsession with engineering grandeur. To truly grasp their place in Roman life, you must see them as parts of the larger hydraulic system, a network as vital as the roads that carried armies or the aqueducts that glittered in the sun. Picture the water's journey. It began miles away, where aqueducts tapped clean springs and mountain streams, flowing in steady silence across valleys, over bridges, and beneath hills. Gravity did the work, carrying the lifeblood of the city with relentless patience. By the time that water reached Rome, it split into channels, some to feed fountains, others to bathe houses, and some, quite deliberately, to flush the latrines. This was no accident of abundance. It was design, born of a civilization that saw mastery of water as the highest expression of order. Step now into one of the grander latrines, perhaps near the Baths of Caracalla or Trajan's Forum. These were not dim, hidden chambers. They were open, airy halls, with vaulted ceilings that caught the light. Rows of marble benches lined the space, carved with elegance. Mosaics might decorate the floor, their tiny tesserae gleaming even in the half-darkness. Showing dolphins, tridents, or patterns of waves, a reminder that water, the element of purification, flowed beneath your feet. To sit here was not just to relieve oneself. It was to feel a part of Rome's vast design, where even waste was managed with dignity. But beneath that beauty lay ruthless pragmatists. Time 0.9. Waste flowed into sewers like the Cloaca Maxima, a structure so enduring that parts of it still survive. Built centuries before the Emia reached its height, it began as a marsh drain, a way to tame the lowlands around the Forum. Over time, it grew into the artery of Rome's sanitation, swallowing the flow from house time 0.65s, baths, and latrines alike. Imagine the roar of water echoing in its vaulted stone belly, carrying away the city's refuse into the Tiber. Dirty though it may have been, it was nonetheless magnificent, a reminder that Rome thrived not just on glory, but on management of the mundane. Of course, such a system came at costs. The river grew fouled, its banks thick with mud and filth. Fishermen cast their nets downstream with reluctance, knowing what currents carried. Yet the city did not stop. To Rome, the greater triumph was not in purity of rivers, but in the endurance of its people. The system worked well enough, and so it endured time 295s, and it was not only in Rome that such marvels appeared. Across the empire, from Londinium in the misty north to Antioch in the blazing east, public toilets sprang up wherever Rome planted its standards. Soldiers in frontier forts used stone-seated latrines, just as senators did in the capital. Merchants in provincial towns sat on benches cut from local limestone, while water channeled from aqueducts carried waste to rivers or seas. Each latrine was a fragment of Rome transplanted, a promise that no matter how far you traveled, the empire's order followed you. Yet step closer to the benches, and you notice something more intimate. Each seat is cut with care, smooth where countless bodies have rested. The spacing is deliberate, close enough for conversation, distant enough to allow comfort. In some places, archaeologists have even found evidence of armrests or dividers, modest attempts to balance community with privacy. It reminds you that Romans, though communal, were not without awareness of the individual, even in these most public of places. Architecture sought harmony between the shared and the personal. And while you sit, water flows beneath you, constant, ceaseless. It is that sound that defined the Roman toilet as much as its stone. The trickle and gurgle reassured the ear, told the mind that filth did not linger. It was a lullaby of civilization, time 65s, a song of order against chaos. For in the Roman imagination, stagnant water meant corruption, disease, and decay. Flowing water meant purity, renewal, life. The engineers understood this truth instinctively, and so they built toilets that whispered reassurance even as they carried away the empire's waste. Imagine yourself rising, adjusting your toga, and stepping back into the sunlight of the street. Behind you, the hall continues its quiet work, stones darkened by centuries of use, water running tirelessly below. You leave, but the system remains, endlessly repeating the same cycle for the next citizen, and the next, and the next. In that moment, you begin to see Rome's public toilets not as curiosities of the past, but as threads in the vast tapestry of the empire. They were not only for the body, but for the spirit, proof that even the humblest of acts could be drawn into the order of civilization. The story of Roman toilets does not end with engineering or civic pride. Step closer, and you find yourself confronting the subtler ways these spaces reveal the character of Roman society. They were not merely about function. They became symbols of culture, of philosophy, even of humor. In their echoes, you catch glimpses of how Romans thought about the human body and the fragile dignity of everyday life. Consider the tersorium, the communal sponge affixed to a stick. To modern eyes, it seems crude, even shocking. Yet for the Romans it was practical, economical, and rooted in custom. Dipped into vinegar or salt water, the sponge was meant to cleanse and purify. Time. 5s. Archaeologists have uncovered graffiti and writings that mock its use, reminding us that Romans, like us, could laugh at the awkward realities of bodily functions. The poet Martial, famous for his sharp wit, made sly jokes about sponges and their unfortunate borrowers. For him, even the toilet was fair ground for bestial satire. Yet satire often masks truth. The shared use of the tersorium tells us much about Roman ideas of community and the body. To share such an object was to acknowledge a world in which individuality mattered less than belonging. It reveals a culture where public and private blurred, where the body was less a fortress of solitude and more a participant in communal ritual. The same people who reclined together at banquets, bathed in great halls, and watched spectacles in crowded arenas also relieved themselves side by side. Privacy, as we imagine it, was not a Roman concern, and within this lack of privacy lay a peculiar kind of freedom. Without shame, Romans could speak openly, even in the toilet. Here, gossip flowed like water. A senator might mutter about legislation, a soldier about his commanding officer, a merchant about his debts. Deals were struck, whispers exchanged, friendships deepened. In a world where life was lived in public, forums, baths, theaters, the toilet was just another stage, another backdrop for the ongoing performance of Roman society. Still, danger lurked beneath the familiarity. Ancient sources tell of sudden explosions of methane gas igniting, likely from torches or braziers carried inside. Fires could erupt unexpectedly, startling those seated in calm conversation. There were also fears of creatures from below, rats, snakes, or even insects climbing up through the channels. For Romans, these were not myths, but lived anxieties, woven into the experience of visiting a latrine. It was a reminder that for all their mastery of stone and water, nature still had ways of intruding. Some even sought divine protection. Amulets and charms have been found near ancient toilets, left behind as offerings or carried for luck. In Pompeii, frescoes sometimes showed protective symbols near latrine areas, images meant to ward off misfortune. To use a toilet, then, was not just a physical act, but also a negotiation with unseen force. Time, do not 9/5. The gods, the spirits of water, the dangers of the underworld, all were present in that simple, daily moment. Yet humor was never far away. Imagine a Roman father, seated with his young son, teaching him the habits of civic life while pointing to the sponge with a smile, reminding him not to confuse it with his neighbors, or think of the graffiti scratched into plaster. Jokes, insults, declarations of love, all left behind by people who could not resist leaving a mark, even in a place so humble. The walls of these latrines spoke with as many voices as the forum itself, filled with the chatter of generations who passed through. And so, these spaces become a lens into Roman resilience. Life in the empire was often harsh, disease, hunger, war, but in the toilet, you find traces of humanity that feel startlingly familiar. The mix of practicality and humor, fear and fellowship, order and chaos, all of it reflects the enduring truth that people will always find ways to humanize necessity. As you rise from the stone bench in your imagination, brushing your toga back into place, you carry with you not just the image of Roman sanitation, but the spirit of the people who lived it. They were practical, yes, but also playful. They were unashamed, yet not without anxiety. They were human in every way we still recognize. And perhaps that is the true marvel, not just the engineering of aqueducts and sewers, but the laughter, the whispers, the offerings, and the graffiti. The toilets of Rome remind us that even in the grandest empire, life was lived in the details of the ordinary. Step now into a different corner of Roman life of time, X5s, where toilets were not only public necessities, but also extensions of luxury. For while the common citizen might sit on a plain stone bench, the wealthy surrounded even their most private functions with beauty. Villas and palaces often contained latrines decorated with mosaics, marble fittings, and carefully channeled water. In these space, utility merged with elegance, reminding you that in Rome, grandeur was not reserved for temples or forums alone. It seeped into every aspect of existence. Imagine entering a villa on the Bay of Naples. The atrium glows with afternoon light, its impluvium pool reflecting the painted walls. Beyond the dining room, beyond the garden, court, lies a small chamber. The floor is patterned with sea creatures in mosaic, dolphins leaping, shells scattered, the suggestion of waves curling. Against the wall rests a marble bench, cut to fit the body, polished smooth by years of touch. Beneath it, the water flows as it would in any phoric time, 6/5. But here, The act is framed by artistry. Even the most mundane necessity becomes part of the villa's aesthetic. This blending of necessity and luxury was not frivolous. It reflected a philosophy. Romans believed that civilization meant shaping every part of life, even the basest, into order and beauty. Where others might hide such things, Romans displayed them, adorned them, made them fit for citizens of an empire. To eat, to bathe, to relieve oneself, all could be ennobled by architecture and design. But luxury did not mean separation from the communal spirit. Even in wealthy homes, toilets were often built for multiple people. Time, 0.65 hours. Sometimes with 2 or 3 seats in a row. Privacy was still secondary to function, and conversation still had its place. Yet the surroundings softened the act, transforming necessity into another expression of household refinement. Consider 2. The baths. The great thermae of Rome, Caracalla, Diocletian, Trajan were not only temples of leisure, but also contained integrated latrines. Thousands could pass through these complexes in a day, moving from steaming caldaria to cold frigidaria, and then to the latrine halls, where rows of marble benches continued the social flow. These were not hidden corners, but deliberate parts of the bath's rith. Time 2.6 quartiers, woven into the cycle of cleansing and community. To bathe and then relieve oneself was simply 2 movements in the same ritual of purification. Yet, within these polished spaces, you sense tension. The grandeur disguised the fragility beneath. Water still carried parasites. Communal sponges still spread illness. And though marble gleamed, the dangers of fire, fumes, or creatures below remained. In this way, Roman luxury becomes bittersweet. It dressed necessity in elegance, but could not escape its risks. Still, the symbolism mattered. To walk into a latrine adorned with mosaics was to feel Rome's reach into every corner of life. Time is 0.95s, even where one might expect shame or concealment. Rome declared order, art, and pride. It is telling that when archaeologists uncover such spaces, they often find them as carefully crafted as dining rooms or kitchens, a sign that, for Romans, no act was too humble to escape the embrace of civilization. And, perhaps, in these luxurious latrines, you glimpse the heart of Roman resilience. To face the unavoidable with dignity and even beauty was their way of affirming life. They could not escape the body's needs, but they could surround those needs with marble and mosaic, with laughter and conversation, with water that flowed ceaselessly toward the sea. So as you stand now, gazing at the dolphin mosaics glimmering faintly on the villa floor, you understand, Roman toilets were not merely about waste, they were about identity. They proclaimed what it meant to be Roman, practical yet proud, communal yet refined, unashamed of the body yet eager to elevate it. The empire's strength lay not only in legions and laws, but also in its ability to shape the ordinary into symbols of order. Even here, in a small chamber with a bench of marble, you hear the echo of Rome's greatness, an empire that sought to civilize even necessity itself. The clatter of sandals fades as you follow the water's journey beyond Rome's villas and baths, down into the arteries of the city. For beneath the marble and mosaics, a darker truth flowed. Rome's toilets, while remarkable, were also reminders of the precarious balance between control and chaos. No matter how carefully engineered, the system was never entirely safe. The Romans themselves were aware of the risks. Ancient writers mention sudden bursts of flame erupting from latrines, methane ignited by a careless torch. Imagine sitting in calm conversation when, with a crack, fire leaps from the channel beneath your feet. Panic, shouts, the scramble of togas as men leap from benches. Such incidents were rare but vivid, lingering in Roman memory as proof that even stone and water could not tame the forces below. There were other dangers too. The cloaca maxima and smaller sewers became habitats for creatures, rats, insects, even snakes. Stories spread of serpents slithering up through the drains, startling the unsuspecting. Whether rumor or truth, these tales colored the imagination, making every visit to a latrine an act of uneasy trust. Some carried charms to ward off misfortune. Others muttered prayers to Cloacina, seeking her protection against the unseen. The smell itself carried fear. Romans believed in miasma, the idea that foul air bred disease. To them, the vapors rising from the channels were not just unpleasant, but dangerous. Some latrines were designed with chimneys or vents to draw gases away. Time 0.65, while braziers burned inside to mask odors and steady the air. Yet unease lingered. To sit in such a place was to balance confidence in Roman engineering with the quiet dread of what might rise from below. Still, necessity overcame fear. People returned, day after day, because life demanded it. And in that repetition, the dangers became woven into the rhythm of existence, accepted like the risks of crossing a crowded street or eating food from a vendor's stall. Romans learned to live with the hazards, joking about them, guarding against them, but never abandoning the communal halls. And perhaps it was humor that made the difference. Graffiti discovered near latrine sites suggests that people laughed at their fears, turning discomfort into jokes. Beware the snake, one scribble might warn, half in jest, half in caution. Others mocked neighbors or made crude puns about sponges. The walls themselves became companions, absorbing laughter and fear time in fives. But dangers were not only natural, they were also social. In crowded latrines, theft was common. A man distracted in conversation might find his purse cut away, his sandals swapped for a poorer pair. Some sat on their belongings to guard them. Others came with slaves to stand watch. Even here, amid the flow of water, the inequalities of Roman life persisted. The wealthy could afford attendants. The poor could not. Yet all shared the same risks of fire, foul air, and creatures from below. It is here, in these dangers, that Roman latrines reveal their paradox. They were triumphs of order times 6 yet reminders of vulnerability. They showed the reach of civilization, yet whispered of nature's persistence. To use them was to participate in the empire's strength, but also to accept its limits. Imagine yourself seated there once more. Around you, men speak casually, trading jokes and news. Yet in the back of every mind lingers the knowledge. Beneath those polished stones lies a world untamed, a world that can erupt in flame, send creatures crawling, or poison the air itself. And so each visit becomes a small act of courage, a negotiation between trust in Rome and fear of what Rome cannot master. As you leave, stepping into the bright streets once more, you carry with you the truth that even in the greatest empire, daily life was never without risk. The toilets of Rome stand as reminders that civilization, no matter how advanced, always balances on the edge of chaos. As you wander further into this hidden world, you notice how Roman toilets reflected not only the city's ingenuity and dangers, but also its deep sense of hierarchy. For though all citizens shared the same stone benches, the differences between rich and poor, free and enslaved, were never far from view. In the crowded forcae of the Subura, the poor sat shoulder to shoulder, their sandals worn thin, their tunics frayed from labo, times home 295s. These men and women depended on the city's public halls because their cramped insula, tenement blocks stacked high above the streets, had no private facilities. To them, the latrine was necessity, not choice. The trickle of water beneath their feet was both relief and reminder of their dependence on Rome's systems. The wealthy, by contrast, time 46 psalms, could afford private arrangements. Their villas boasted latrines decorated with mosaics, their benches polished marble, their water supplied by dedicated pipes. For them, relieving oneself might still be communal, but it was communal among equals, family, guests, or household slaves who stood nearby with towels or sponges. Privacy was absent, but refinement remained. The contrast between these worlds was sharp, yet both were stitched together by the same flowing channels, the same sewers that carried away waste to the Tiber. Then there were the slaves, whose relationship to Roman toilets was more labor than use. It was their hands that cleaned the halls, their duty to fetch water for sponges, their task to empty cesspits when the flow slowed. They were the unseen maintainers of a system that seemed effortless to the citizen seated above. For them, latrines were not places of gossip or laughter, but of toil, burden, and filth. The comfort of the few rested on the labor of the many. Even soldiers experienced this divide. In frontier forts, military latrines were lined with stone benches like any Roman city, but their design reflected discipline and order. A legionary might sit beside his comrade, both bound by the rhythm of drills and campaigns, their conversation perhaps about tomorrow's march rather than politics or gossip. These latrines reminded soldiers that Rome's discipline extended into every detail of life, binding the body into the empire's service. Yet, despite these divides, latrines also acted as social equalizers. Once seated, the toga of a senator and the tunic of a laborer meant little. The act itself leveled hierarchy, if only for a few moments. Historians often remark that toilets were among the rare spaces where class distinctions blurred, where the high and the low endured the same necessities side by side. In that sense, the Forika was both a stage for inequality and a moment to escape from it. The contrast was perhaps most visible in Pompeii, times also 65, where archaeologists have uncovered both luxurious private toilets and humble street-side ones. In wealthy homes, mosaics of dolphins and shells decorated the floors, while in public, plain benches sufficed. Yet both funneled their waste into the same underground systems. Beneath the earth, the distinctions vanished. Waste from the palace and the tavern flowed together, indistinguishable, anonymous. And here lies a subtle irony. Rome prided itself on hierarchy, on the careful layering of society into senators, equestrians, plebeians, and slaves. Yet the latrine reminded everyone that the body was universal, its needs inescapable, its products alike. Civilization could dress the act in marble or leave it bare in stone, but the truth beneath was the same. The Cloaca Maxima accepted no ranks. It swallowed the emperor's waste as readily as the beggar's. To walk away from such a place was to feel both humbled and reassured. Humbled, because even Rome's might could not elevate the body beyond its simplest functions. Reassured, because Rome had found a way to turn even that into order, binding every citizen into the same network of stone and water. As you step back into the sunlit street, the echoes of hierarchy linger. You recall the mosaics of the villa, the worn benches of the subura, the discipline of the military fort, and beneath them all, the same flow unites them. It is in this paradox that Rome was both divided and united by necessity, that the true character of its toilets reveals itself. Follow the flow further, and you begin to see how Roman toilets were not just about sanitation, status, or shared humanity. They were also about econom, for in the empire, even waste had value. Nothing, not even what flowed through the Cloaca Maxima, was entirely without purpose. The most famous example comes in the form of urine. Romans collected it in public jars placed along the streets, where passers-by might relieve themselves directly. From there, full amphorae of the liquid were carried to workshops, where it was put to use in surprising ways. The tanners used it to soften hides. The laundries, Pholonica, used it to bleach and clean clothing. Ammonia, carried in urine, broke down grease and dirt in ways no soap of the time could match. In fact, laundries were some of the busiest places in Rome, their workers stomping tunics and cloaks in vats of diluted urine, the air acrid with its sting. Even emperors found profit in this strange commerce. Vespasian, practical and unsentimental, famously imposed a tax on urine collection. The vectigal urinae charged those who bought urine for their trades, turning waste into revenue. When his son Titus mocked the policy, Vespasian is said to have held a coin to his nose and asked, "Does it smell?" When Titus admitted it did not, Vespasian replied, "Yet it comes from urine." Thus was born the saying, "Pecunia non olet," money does not stink. This pragmatic attitude reveals much about Rome. The empire was vast, its needs constant, its hunger for resources unending. If something could be used, it was. If something could be taxed, it would be. Toilets, then, were not only places of necessity, but entry points into networks of trade and finance. What citizens left behind became part of the empire's economy, fueling industries as humble as laundry and as mighty as imperial taxation. But the economic story does not end there. Archaeologists studying ancient cesspits have found evidence that human waste was sometimes reused as fertilizer. In rural areas, where aqueducts did not always reach, pits collected what could later enrich fields. The cycle of life and labor turned even filth into growth. Farmers, bound by necessity, treated waste as resource, long before modern sanitation created a divide between purity and pollution. Yet this economic use carried risks. Disease spread easily when waste was handled, and the stench of laundries often clung to neighborhoods. The fullones, laundry workers, were sometimes mocked for their trade, their association with filth making them socially marginal, even as their work was essential. Here, too, Roman toilets reveal contradiction. What was profitable could also be shameful. What sustained the city could also mark one as unclean. Still, the principle endured. Nothing wasted, everything harnessed. This was the Roman genius. Pragmatism elevated to policy, even when it brushed against discomfort. The very act of taxation on urine shows how far the empire's logic reached. It cared little for delicacy. It cared for order, for resource, for revenue. And so, when you picture a Roman latrine now, you must also picture the network of jars in the streets, the tanner pounding hides in acrid vats, the washer stamping garments in pungent tubs. You must see Vespasian counting his coins, unmoved by their source. You must recognize that toilets, far from being marginal, sat at the center of an economic web that touched every corner of Roman life. The irony, of course, is sharp. What citizens dismissed as waste, Rome transformed into wealth. What seemed foul, Rome declared useful. And what began in the shadows of stone benches became part of the empire's prosperity. As you step back from this realization, you understand that Roman toilets were not only symbols of engineering or community, but also of economy itself. They remind us that in Rome, everything could be turned into value, even the most unseemly of substances. Step still deeper into the Roman world, and you begin to see how toilets reveal not only the empire's pragmatism, but also its fragility. Time, 5. For even in their triumph of engineering, economy, and culture, these spaces carried hidden costs, costs that shaped Roman health in ways they could not fully grasp. Archaeologists today, scraping through hardened layers of ancient latrine soil, have uncovered a startling truth. Rome was not as clean as it believed. Parasite, eggs, whipworm, roundworm, tapeworm, cling to the remnants of waste, proof that diseases flourished in the very systems meant to prevent them. The flowing water carried filth away. Yes, but it also spread contamination. Communal sponges, shared benches, damp air, all became avenues for illness. Romans prided themselves on hygiene, but their own habits betrayed them. Imagine the irony. A senator might leave a marble-seated latrine, convinced that Rome's greatness had conquered even bodily necessity, only to carry unseen parasites within him. A soldier, disciplined and strong, might share a sponge with his comrades and later fall ill on campaign. Even the poor, who depended most on the communal halls, paid a price in lingering fevers, stomach pains, and weakness. The very invention that symbolized civilization also carried its flaws into every household. Yet the Romans endured, because endurance was their way. Illness was explained through miasma, bad air, or the displeasure of gods. Remedies were sought in herbs, prayers, or rituals. Few connected the danger to the latrines themselves. Instead, life continued as it always had. Citizens sat side by side. The water trickled below, and laughter and gossip filled the air. Civilizatio time zu 6 Tages to them was intact, even if unseen enemies flourished. And perhaps this is the greatest lesson. Rome's toilets remind us that progress is rarely without paradox. They were magnificent. Yes, stone-carved benches, mosaics, flowing water. But they were also flawed, spreading sickness even as they promised health. The empire's genius lay not in perfection, but in persistence. Rome kept building, kept channeling water, kept carving benches across provinces, because to abandon the system would be to abandon civilization itself. Still, cracks appeared. As the empire aged, maintenance falter, time 295s. Aqueducts ran dry in troubled regions, sewers clogged, public latrines fell into disrepair. What had once been symbols of order became symbols of neglect. In some provinces, the glory of marble benches gave way to crumbling stone and stagnant water. The system's decline mirrored the empire's own. Grand, once unshakable, time also 6 fives, but vulnerable when left untended. And yet, even in ruin, the latrines endured. Excavations in Pompeii, Ostia, Herculaneum, and countless provincial towns show them still standing, their benches silent but intact, their channels dry but visible. They are echoes of a world where even waste was bound into the story of empire. To walk among them now is to feel the presence of countless lives, merchants, soldiers, slaves, senators, who once shared those spaces, their voices long gone, but their imprint still etched in stone. So when you think of Rome, do not picture only the Colosseum or the Forum, the triumphal arches or the marble temples. Picture also the humbler halls, where necessity became community, where filth became economy, where beauty was carved into benches of stone. Picture the Forica, echoing with laughter and gossip, carrying away both waste and worry into the unseen depths. For in those halls lies the truest reflection of Rome. Pragmatic, communal, flawed, and enduring. Civilization, after all, is not built only in monuments of glory, but also in how it answers the most basic needs of life. Rome's greatness lay in daring to make even those needs part of its order. And as you step back from this journey, hearing once more the trickle of water, the scrape of sandals, the murmur of voices, you realize the odd truth. The story of Roman toilets is not just the story of waste. It is the story of empire itself, brilliant and imperfect, proud and vulnerable, forever human. The echoes of Rome's toilets carry us now into the provinces, where their presence told conquered peoples that Rome had arrived. They were not merely conveniences. They were statements of identity, carved into stone and flowing with water, reminders that the empire brought not only legions and laws, but also its peculiar brand of order. Imagine Londinium, damp and windswept on the edge of Britannia. Wooden streets cut through marshy ground, and Roman settlers worked to impose their rhythm upon the wild island. Here, too, latrines appeared, stone-seated, water-fed, small copies of those in Rome. For the native Britons, who had lived with pit toilets or open disposal, these new halls must have seemed remarkable. To sit on carved benches, hear water flowing beneath, and see waste carried away, was to feel the weight of empire pressing into daily life. Rome civilized, even in the most intimate of spaces. Further east, in Antioch, the latrines were grander, echoing the prosperity of the city. Archaeologists have uncovered long halls, their benches shaded by colonnades, their channels fed by aqueducts that gleamed in the sun. Merchants from across the Mediterranean, Syrians, Greeks, Romans, Jews, might have sat there together, their tongues weaving a dozen languages, their waste all carried away by the same stream. Toilets became crossroads, just as much as markets or ports, binding cultures into one network of stone and water. Even in the distant forts along the Danube, latrines followed the Roman plan. Soldiers dug trenches, lined them with stone, and channeled water through them. To use such a place was to feel Rome's order, even on the edge of barbarian forests. Latrines were a reassurance. No matter how far from the Forum, you were still within the empire's embrace. And yet, these latrines also carried messages of power. To build one was to demonstrate Rome's control over water, over space, over life itself. A conquered town might lose its independence, but it gained aqueduct, time Talmud 6 now baths, and toilets, a trade of freedom for infrastructure. The message was clear. Rome could command not only armies, but also rivers, turning nature into servant of empire. But the provinces also shaped the latrines in return. Local stone was used. Local styles of mosaic adorned floors. Local labor maintained the flow. Time 0 go in this way. Each toilet became a blend of Rome and region, a hybrid space where emire and province met in shared necessity. To sit on a bench in Carthage or Cologne was to experience Rome filtered through local hands, reminding you that the empire was both uniform and diverse. And perhaps, in these provincial latrines, the empire's character is most visible. Rome's genius lay not only in conquering, but in assimilating, in binding peoples together through shared systems. Toilets, humble though they seem, were part of this process. They taught conquered peoples new habits, introduced them to communal spaces, and drew them into Rome's networks of water and waste. Civilization, to Rome, was not only marble temples and triumphal arches, it was also the steady trickle beneath a row of stone benches. Yet these provincial toilets also reveal fragility. When aqueducts fell into disrepair, when maintenance faltered, when invasions disrupted supply, the system collapsed. Abandoned latrines became stagnant pits, symbols not of order, but of decay. In the ruins of Roman towns, archaeologists find them dry and crumbling, silent reminders of how quickly civilization can unravel when its veins of water run dry. As you picture these latrines across the empire, grand in Antioch, modest in Londinium, disciplined in frontier forts, you see more than architecture. You see Rome's promise and its peril. To build such places was to weave conquered lands into the fabric of empire. To lose them was to let that fabric fray. And so the story of Roman toilets becomes the story of Rome's expansion itself, the spread of order, the blending of cultures, the fragility of maintenance, the endurance of stone. In their benches and channels, you glimpse the reach of an emul that sought to civilize even necessity, and the limits of that reach when its waters ceased to flow. The water still flows in your imagination, yet now it carries you beyond Rome's streets and provinces into the private lives of its people. For toilets were not only communal spaces or symbols of empire, they also touched family, intimacy, and the rhythms of domestic life. Step into a Roman home, and you begin to see how necessity threaded itself through walls of plaster and stone. In modest insula, the tall, crowded apartment blocks where most Romans lived, latrines were often little more than pots or makeshift pits. Some residents carried waste-to-cesspits in the courtyards. Others emptied jars into the street below, the contents splashing across stone pavements. The smell of urine and refuse mingled with smoke from kitchens, the cries of vendors, the bray of animals. For the urban poor, sanitation was fragile, half-managed, always at risk of spilling back into their daily lives. The Forica offered relief, but home remained a place where necessity was harder to control. In wealthier domus, however, latrines were integrated into architecture. They might be tucked discreetly near the kitchen, where water channels could also serve drains. Sometimes they stood beside baths, sharing the same flow. The walls around them might bear painted frescoes, the floor set with mosaics, the bench cut from marble. Yet, no matter how refined, the act remained communal. A household might have 2 or 3 seats together, serving family and guests alike. Privac, time, au, once more, gave way to function and togetherness. Children, too, were shaped by these spaces. Imagine a father guiding his young son into the latrine, teaching him how to perch on the bench, how to dip the sponge stick, how to rinse it in vinegar or salt water. Lessons of necessity became lessons of civility, binding the child into Roman identity through the humblest of rituals. What for us might be a private, awkward matter was for them a public education in belonging. Women, too, shared in this communal rhythm. Separate facilities existed in public spaces, though not always with strict divisio. In homes, women used the same latrines as men, often with slaves or attendants nearby. For Roman women, necessity was bound into a larger web of household management, ordering water, directing slaves, maintaining hygiene. They lived with the same communal exposure, but with added labor in ensuring that children and households kept to the rhythms of cleanliness Rome demanded. And then there were the slaves, ever present. In homes, they prepared sponges, fetched water, cleaned cesspits, and endured the burdens their masters left behind. In public, they tended to their owners, stood guard over belonging, time 00.65s, or even relieved themselves beside them. To be enslaved was to be bound into every rhythm of the body, not only in labor, but in presence. The latrine was another place where their subjugation was visible, as they stood silently while citizens conversed. Yet, despite the hardships, there was also laughter. Archaeological finds suggest that toilets could be places of play for children, who treated sponges and sticks as toys, or scribbled graffiti on the walls. One graffito in Pompeii reads almost like a child's taunt, scratched low on the plaster, a joke about filth, too simple to be anything but youthful mischief. In these marks, you see the humanity of Romans not as distant figures of marble, but as people living, laughing, and joking through the same necessities we know today. The domestic toilet, then, tells us much about Rome. It shows the divide between rich and poor, between villa and insula. It shows the role of slaves and women in sustaining household rhyth, time 0.95s. It shows how children were taught, how family life was lived, how necessity blurred boundaries of intimacy. And it shows, above all, that Rome's greatness was not built only in forums and legions, but also in kitchens, courtyards, and the small chambers where waste flowed into channels unseen. Picture yourself now leaving such a household, time 0.95s. The atrium glitters with sunlight. The impluvium pool reflects the sky, and behind the walls lies the small chamber where necessity hums like an echo of life. To understand Rome, you realize, is not to study only its triumphs, but also its toilets. For in them, you find the truth of daily existence, messy, communal, enduring, and profoundly human. The story of Rome's toilets is not confined to stone benches and trickling water. It is also told in words, carved into walls or whispered through literature. For the Romans, humor, poetry, and satire clung to these spaces as tightly as the smell of vinegar-soaked sponge. In graffiti, in verse, and in anecdotes, toilets became stages for the human voice, echoing across centuries. Step into Pompeii, where plaster walls once rang with chatter. Here, archaeologists have uncovered graffiti scrawled near latrines, crude drawings, jokes, and insult, time, 9 fives. One inscription mocks a neighbour's smell, another jeers at poor manners. Still others are bawdy, laced with innuendo. These words remind us that toilets were not silent halls of shame, but places alive with laughter and mischief. Even in the most ordinary act, Romans could not resist leaving behind their wit. Writer 2. Found inspiration in these spaces. Martial, master of epigrams, often mocked the indignities of communal sponges and the awkwardness of sharing. His verses, sharp as daggers, turned necessity into comedy. He sneered at the wealthy who pretended refinement, yet sat upon the same stone benches as commoner. Juvenal, another satirist, used the image of foul latrines to underscore the corruption of Roman morals, likening public men to waste carried away by sewers. To them, toilets were metaphors as much as realities, symbols of both equality and decay. Even philosophers were not immune. Seneca, in his Letters, remarked on the noise of communal latrines as proof of life's distractions. To him, the hum of voices and the trickle of water became lessons in endurance, reminders that the wise man must rise above annoyance. In his words, a latrine was no different than the forum, both filled with noise, both demanding patience. But it was the humor that lingered most. Romans laughed at the dangers, at the absurdities, at the sheer humanity of it all. Imagine two men seated side by side, one boasting of his wealth, the other pointing out that the sponge they shared cared little for riches. Or, picture graffiti scratched by a playful hand. Here sat Marcus, swift as the water below. Such wit softened the edges of necessity, turning discomfort into community. These voices, preserved in stone and parchment, remind us that Roman toilets were not sterile relics, but living spaces of sound and spirit. They show us that laughter echoed as strongly as fear, that satire thrived even amid filth, that wit flowed as surely as water. And they tell us something timeless, wherever people gather. Even in the humblest of spaces, stories will follow. Yet behind the humor lies honesty. In their jokes, Romans admitted their unease. In their satire, they revealed their anxieties about class, corruptio, time, 0.65s, and fragility. In their graffiti, they left behind the raw truth of daily life, unfiltered, unadorned, alive. These words are perhaps more telling than any marble bench, for they reveal the mind as well as the body, the soul as well as the system. As you linger among these voices, you realize that the latrine was never swamped. It was alive with conversation, laughter, insults, poetry, and prayer. It was a place where Rome's people, rich and poor, witty and weary, left behind not only waste but words. And through those words, they still speak, centuries later. Across the broken stones of Pompeii and the faded pages of satire, to study Rome's toilets, then, is not only to study engineering or hygiene, it is to listen to voices long gone, voices that laughed complained, mocked, and taught. Voices that make Rome not a distant empire of marble statues, but a city of living. Breathing, joking, suffering human beings. The voices of satire fade, and in their place you hear the quieter murmur of religion. For in Rome, nothing escaped the touch of the divine, not even toilets. Beneath the stone benches and trickling channels lay a spiritual dimension, one that bound necessity into ritua, time to times. Fear into prayer, and filth into reverence. At the heart of this spiritual web was Cloacina, the goddess of sewers. Her name, drawn from the cloaca, tied her directly to the channels that carried away the city's waste. She was no minor spirit. She had a shrine near the Cloaca Maxima itself, one of the most enduring structures in Rome. Imagine citizens pausing before her altar, offering flowers or coins, whispering prayers that the great sewer continue to flow, that filth not rise, that illness remain at bay. In honoring Cloacina, Romans admitted a truth. Their civilization depended not only on legions and laws, but also on the hidden rivers beneath their feet. Other deities, too, brushed against this realm. Fortuna, goddess of luck, might be invoked before entering a latrine, for dangers lurked there, fires, fumes, or vermin. Household gods, the Lars, were sometimes given offerings near domestic toilets, ensuring purity and safety. Even Neptune, Lord of Waters, was honored in mosaics that decorated latrine floors, dolphins leaping and shells glimmering as symbols of cleansing streams. In these images, necessity merged with reverence. The body's act lifted into a sacred cycle of water and renewal. Superstition filled the spaces as, well, amulets have been uncovered near latrines, charms shaped to ward off spirits or misfortune. Some Romans believed that evil forces could rise from below, carried in vapors or borne by unseen creatures. To enter a latrine without protection was to risk not only physical harm, but spiritual corruption. And so, alongside sponges and basin ×6, one might find talismans of bone, bronze, or carved stone, left as guardians against the unknown. These beliefs were not empty gestures. They reveal a society deeply aware of vulnerability. The toilet, after all, was a place where one was exposed, body uncovered, defenses lower, time soquan 1999 office. To pray, to offer, to charm was to reclaim a measure of control, to weave the divine into a moment of fragility. Romans did not separate the sacred from the ordinary. They bound them together, ensuring that even waste was touched by ritual. But religion also offered metaphor. Philosophers and poets often compared moral corruption to filth, the cleansing of the soul to the flow of water. Just as sewers carried waste to the Tiber, so virtue carried away vice. The Cloaca Maxima became a symbol not only of engineering, but of purification, a reminder that Rome's greatness lay in mastering both the visible and the hidden. Picture yourself now entering a grand latrine near the baths. On the floor, a mosaic gleams with sea creatures, their forms shimmering in the dim light. On the wall, perhaps a painted symbol meant to ward off evil. In the corner, a small altar holds an offering, ashes from a sacrifice, a coin left in hope. Around you, citizens sit and talk, yet beneath their chatter lies an undercurrent of reverence. They know that what flows beneath them is more than water. It is part of the sacred order, watched over by gods who govern even filth. And so the Roman toilet becomes not just a place of necessity, but a shrine of sorts, a space where daily life touched eternity. To sit there was to be Homer, yes, but also to be Roman, practical, communal, reverent, and aware of forces greater than oneself. In this blending of necessity and divinity, Rome reveals its deepest truth, that civilization is not built by stone alone, but by the beliefs that infuse stone with meaning. Even in the echoing halls of latrines, the divine was present, whispering in the trickle of water and the shadows of stone. The story of Rome's toilets now begins to draw to its close, yet the echoes they leave behind linger like the trickle of water beneath stone. They are ruins today, silent benches, dry channels, mosaics half faded. But through them we glimpse the essence of Rome itself, practical and extravagant, communal and hierarchical, proud and yet profoundly vulnerable. Think of what they reveal about Roman life. Here was a people who believed that even necessity could be civilized, carved into marble, adorned with mosaics, made part of civic pride. To sit in a latrine was to sit in a shared ritual, where conversation, gossip, and laughter flowed as freely as the water below. The poor depended on them, the wealthy embellished them, the slaves maintained them, all bound together by the same system. In these spaces, Rome's paradox was laid bare, a society divided by status, yet united by the body's need, time, 9/5, think, 2, of their economy. Waste was not waste to Rome. Urine became resource, taxed by emperors, used by tanners and laundries, folded into the empire's economy as naturally as grain or oil. In this pragmatism lay Rome's genius, nothing excluded, nothing left behind. Everything drawn into the machine of civilization. The saying pecunia non olet, money does not stink, still lingers as proof of their unsentimental logic. But think also of fragility. Archaeologists tell us of parasites in ancient soil, proof that disease thrived in the very halls meant to promote health. Writers remind us of fire, fumes, and vermin, dangers lurking beneath stone benches. The toilets were triumphs of engineering, yes, but also carriers of risk. Rome mastered water, but never fully mastered nature. The same systems that symbolized order carried within them the seeds of decay. And finally, think of belief. Toilets were not godless places. Cloacina watched over the sewers. Fortuna was invoked for luck. Amulets were carried to ward off evil. Even filth had its deities, its rituals, its symbols. In this, Rome revealed its true character, a civilization that infused every act, no matter how humble, with meaning. To relieve oneself was to take part in the sacred rhythm of water, to share in a divine cycle that bound gods and men together. What remains of these spaces today? In Ostia, you can still walk among rows of marble benches, their holes cut smooth by centuries of use. In Pompeii, you can trace mosaics that once shimmered beneath lamplight. In Rome itself, the Cloaca Maxima still carries water, as it has for over 2,000 years. The voices are gone, but the stones endure, whispering of lives once lived in their shadow. And as you stand there, in imagination or in ruin, you realize why these toilets matter. They remind us that civilization is not built only in triumphal arches or temples, not only in speeches or battles. It is built in the ordinary, in how we eat, how we was time, how we relieve ourselves. Rome's greatness was not only in what it conquered, but in how it shaped the smallest rhythms of daily life into order. To study these spaces is to strip Rome of its marble mask and see its humanity. To hear the laughter in graffiti, the satire in poetry, the prayers to Closina, the gossip of neighbors. To know that emperors and beggars alike sat side by side, united by the body's necessity. To see that even the mightiest empire, for all its power, was subject to the same humbling truths we face today. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson. Rome's toilets remind us that history is not only grand battles or glittering temples, it is also benches of stone, flowing water, and the simple, shared acts that make us human. In their echoes, we find not only the story of an empire, but the story of ourselves. The journey through Rome's stone-lined halls is over now, and the echoes fade into stillness. The benches stand empty, the mosaics quiet, the waters trickle, reduced to memory. What remains is not noise or bustle, but a calm awareness that even in the greatest empires, life has always been shaped by the simplest rhythms. Let yourself drift with that thought. The people of Rome, senators in their white togas, merchants dusty from the streets, children laughing at their own mischief, were not so different from your time. 2.95s. They worried, they joked, they sought comfort, they endured what was unpleasant and found ways to make it communal. Their voices have long since vanished, yet the hum of their daily life lingers in the stones, like a soft vibration carried forward in time. Now imagine yourself leaving those marble benches and stepping into twilight. The city quiets around you, the markets closing, the air cooling as evening comes. A faint wind passes through the narrow streets, carrying with it the smell of bread, the hush of fountains, the glow of lamps being lit one by one. You walk slowly, knowing that the world you have glimpsed is both long, gone, and forever present in the rhythms of our own lives. Breathe gently, as the Romans once did, comforted by the sound of water flowing beneath their feet. Allow that sound to guide you, like a steady current carrying away the noise of the day. Each breath you take is a reminder of order, of continuity, of the quiet truth that life's most ordinary moments are all of the most enduring. Close your eyes now. Let marble fade into mist. Let water soften into silence. The empire recedes, leaving only calm. You are safe. You are still. You are at rest. Sleep well, traveler.